When we face trials, it's easy to become consumed by them, as though our world is collapsing with every setback. But let us pause for a moment and consider, where do our minds naturally turn in the midst of trouble? For many of us, the tendency is to focus entirely on the problem itself, on the discomfort, the uncertainty, and the fear that may accompany it. Yet, such a focus does not aid us in overcoming the trial. Rather, it only strengthens the grip of the challenge on our hearts. In the Christian life, we are called to take a different path, one that involves looking beyond the problem and focusing instead on God. This is not to say that we ignore the difficulties in our lives, for they are often very real and deeply troubling. Instead, the challenge lies in redirecting our gaze from the storm around us to the steady hand of the Creator who holds the storm in his grasp. Faith, not in the absence of problems, but in the presence of God. Our faith is not made strong by the mere absence of trouble, but by our recognition that God remains sovereign over all things. It is often through difficulty that our faith is refined. When we focus on God, we see that He is at work in ways we may not always immediately understand. This does not remove our difficulties, but it infuses them with a greater sense of purpose. Our problems become, in the light of God's promises, opportunities for deeper trust and transformation. A shift in perspective is necessary. Imagine, if you will, a person standing on the edge of a vast ocean, struggling to see beyond the waves that crash at their feet. The waves are big and loud, consuming their attention. But if they were to lift their eyes to the horizon, they would see that the ocean is but part of a grander landscape, one that stretches far beyond the confines of the waves. So it is with our problems. When we focus solely on them, they appear insurmountable. But when we shift our focus to God, who is eternal and all-encompassing, we begin to understand that no trial, no matter how great, can compare to His glory. Recognizing God's sovereignty is not merely an intellectual exercise, it is an act of trust. We are not called to make sense of everything that happens, nor to figure out how every circumstance fits into the grand design. But we are called to trust that God, in His wisdom, is working in ways that are often unseen. His ways are higher than ours, and His understanding surpasses our own. Focusing on Him means letting go of the need to control everything and accepting that His plans are greater than our limited understanding can grasp. Faith is often misunderstood as something that shields us from difficulty, a spiritual armor that keeps us from experiencing hardship or pain. People frequently expect that once they place their trust in God, their lives will become free of trouble, or at the very least, the magnitude of their problems will be lessened. However, this view of faith is not only incomplete but ultimately misleading. Faith does not remove the presence of suffering, nor does it promise an absence of challenges. Instead, true faith focuses on something far deeper, an understanding and recognition of God's ever-present power, sovereignty, and wisdom, even in the midst of adversity. At its core, faith is not merely a belief in God's existence, or even in His ability to solve our problems. It is the trusting, continual turning of our hearts toward God, especially when life is hard. This trust is not blind optimism or the denial of hardship. It is the assurance that God's presence is with us in every circumstance, whether we are facing trials or experiencing moments of peace. The essence of faith, therefore, is not to eliminate problems, but to change how we perceive and respond to them. One of the key misunderstandings about faith is that it is only valuable when things are going well. People often equate blessings with the absence of difficulties. In such thinking, when a trial arises, faith seems to be useless because it fails to provide the immediate relief expected. Yet the true nature of faith is revealed most powerfully when we face hardship. It is in the midst of our trials that faith becomes more than a passive belief. It becomes an active force that shapes how we navigate the challenges ahead. Instead of looking to God solely for deliverance from our struggles, faith leads us to look to Him for His comfort, guidance, and sustaining power as we walk through them. God's presence is the key to a faith that sustains us. Faith is not about the absence of suffering, but about the awareness of God's presence in the midst of it. In the scriptures, we find numerous examples of individuals who faced tremendous hardships yet found strength not in the absence of problems, but in the assurance that God was with them. Consider the stories of Job, Joseph, or David. Job's faith didn't prevent his immense suffering, rather. His faith was revealed in how he responded to his pain, acknowledging God's sovereignty and trusting that His purposes were higher than his understanding. Joseph's faith didn't remove him from the pit or the prison, but it sustained him through them, enabling him to see God's hand at work even in dark times. David, fleeing from Saul, found solace not in the absence of persecution, but in the fact that God was with him, even in the wilderness. What these examples teach us is that faith is not about expecting a life free from difficulty, but about holding fast to the truth that God is present with us through every trial. This shift in perspective can transform how we approach life's challenges. Instead of seeing God as a cosmic problem solver whose purpose is to remove hardship, we begin to see Him as a loving Father who walks with us, strengthens us, and helps us grow through our difficulties. This understanding of faith changes how we view the role of problems in our lives. Instead of seeing them as burdens to be avoided, we learn to see them as opportunities for growth, refinement, and a deeper relationship with God. The Apostle James writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." James 1:2-3. James is not suggesting that trials are easy or pleasurable, but rather that through the trials our faith matures. The testing of our faith is a process that strengthens our spiritual muscles, enabling us to trust God more deeply and depend on His grace more fully. Faith also has an aspect of eternal perspective. It helps us to look beyond the immediate problem to see the larger picture of God's eternal purposes. This perspective allows us to view our struggles not as ultimate in themselves, but as part of a larger divine narrative. In the grand scheme of eternity, our temporal problems are brief moments, and God is using these moments to shape us for His greater purposes. This understanding frees us from the trap of seeing our lives as defined solely by our difficulties, and it reorients us to trust in God's greater plan, which extends far beyond our earthly existence. True faith is a focus on God's presence, not merely on the absence of problems. It is an acknowledgement that no matter the challenge we face, God is greater, and His love and wisdom are sufficient to sustain us through it. Faith reminds us that we are not alone, even in the darkest moments. It is the anchor that holds us steady when everything around us seems to be in chaos. Far from being a passive belief in a life without difficulty, faith is the active trust in God's goodness, even in the midst of hardship, knowing that He is using every situation to draw us closer to Him and to shape us into the people He desires us to be. Perspective shift, focusing on God rather than our problems. Our natural inclination when facing difficulties is to focus intensely on the problem at hand. The weight of our challenges can dominate our thoughts, emotions, and even our physical responses. Whether it's a personal setback, a family crisis, financial stress, or any number of other struggles, problems can quickly become the lens through which we view everything in our lives. The longer we remain fixated on these challenges, the greater they seem to grow, and the more powerless we feel to overcome them. This is where a critical shift in perspective becomes necessary. Instead of allowing the problem to consume our focus, we must turn our attention to God. Focusing on God rather than on our problems doesn't mean ignoring or denying the difficulties we face. It does not mean pretending that everything is fine when it is not. Rather, it is an intentional decision to prioritize God's presence, His promises, and His power over the immediate challenge. This shift in perspective allows us to see our problems not as insurmountable obstacles, but as temporary circumstances that are held in God's sovereign hands. It invites us to stop viewing life through the narrow lens of what we are currently experiencing and instead open our eyes to the broader, eternal perspective that God offers. One of the most profound ways that focusing on God changes our perspective is by helping us see that our problems, though painful, are not the ultimate reality. While our trials feel overwhelming in the moment, they are, in the grand scheme of things, temporary. The Apostle Paul offers a powerful insight into this perspective shift when he writes, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." 2 Corinthians 4:17. Paul acknowledges the reality of suffering but points to the eternal glory that awaits, showing that the temporary struggles we face are far outweighed by the lasting peace and joy that come from God. This does not diminish the pain of the current struggle, but it reframes it within the context of eternity, reminding us that our current circumstances are not permanent. This shift in focus allows us to stop measuring our lives by the scale of our problems. When we focus only on what is in front of us, the problem often appears to be all-consuming. It seems to define us, to control our thoughts, and to dictate our mood. Yet by turning our gaze to God, we are reminded that we are not defined by our challenges. We are defined by our relationship with God, by His love for us, and by the identity He has given us as His children. As the psalmist writes, "I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." Psalm 121:1-2. The psalmist lifts his eyes to God, not to the mountains of trouble before him, because he knows that God, the creator of everything, is far greater than the challenges he faces. This perspective shift, from focusing on the problem to focusing on God, frees us from the feeling of helplessness and restores a sense of hope and purpose. Focusing on God gives us a deeper understanding of His sovereignty. In a world that can often feel chaotic and out of control, we are invited to trust that God is in control of everything. Our problems, though real and often distressing, do not escape His notice. In fact, the Bible assures that God is intimately involved in our lives, even in the most difficult moments. In the book of Isaiah, God declares, "For I am the Lord your God, who takes hold of your right hand and says to you, 'Do not fear, I will help you.'" Isaiah 41:13. This is a reminder that God is not distant or uninvolved in our suffering. He is right there with us, offering His support, His guidance, and His comfort. By focusing on God, we are reminded that He holds our lives in His hands and that no situation is beyond His power to transform. When we focus on God instead of our problems, we also begin to cultivate an attitude of gratitude and trust. It is easy to become overwhelmed by the demands of life, but when we focus on God's faithfulness, we begin to see the many ways He has worked in our lives. We realize that even in our darkest moments, God has been with us, providing for our needs, offering His peace, and revealing His goodness. This shift in focus allows us to cultivate a heart of thankfulness, even in the midst of difficulty, as we recognize that God is always at work, shaping us and preparing us for something greater. This deeper trust enables us to let go of the anxiety and worry that often accompany our problems, and instead rest in the certainty that God is in control. Focusing on God rather than on our problems encourages a mindset of purpose. When we allow our challenges to define us, we risk falling into despair, as though our lives are nothing more than a series of setbacks. But when we shift our focus to God, we begin to see that our difficulties are not meaningless. They are part of a larger plan, one in which God is using our experiences to mold us into the people He wants us to be. This perspective helps us to understand that, even in the most difficult moments, God is still at work, shaping our character and preparing us for the good works He has planned for us. By turning our attention to God, we are not simply avoiding our problems, but rather gaining a new vision for how to navigate them. Instead of seeing them as obstacles to our happiness, we begin to view them as opportunities for growth, as ways through which we can draw closer to God, deepen our faith, and become more like Christ. Focusing on God opens our eyes to the bigger picture, enabling us to see that our problems, though painful, are not the end of the story. With God's help, they become stepping stones on the path to greater spiritual maturity and eternal glory. God's sovereignty, recognizing God's control over all aspects of life. To understand the importance of focusing on God rather than our problems, it is essential to grasp the concept of God's sovereignty. Sovereignty refers to the supreme authority and absolute control that God has over all things, His dominion over creation, history, and every detail of human life. God's sovereignty is not a distant, abstract idea, but a deeply comforting and practical reality that can transform how we view our struggles and respond to life's challenges. Recognizing God's sovereignty shifts our focus away from the problem itself and towards the God who holds all things in His hands, including our pain and our troubles. At its heart, God's sovereignty means that nothing is outside His control. This is an essential truth that should shape how we view the events of our lives. Whether we are facing personal hardship, external opposition, or global crises, nothing is beyond God's rule. The psalmist declares, "The Lord has established His throne in the heavens, and His kingdom rules over all." Psalm 103:19. This truth reassures us that, regardless of how chaotic or uncertain our circumstances may seem, God is in complete control. The world does not operate according to random chance or the whims of fate. Instead, everything unfolds according to God's sovereign will and purpose. When we recognize God's sovereignty, we are reminded that He is not a passive observer of our lives. He is actively involved in every moment, guiding, sustaining, and working through even the most difficult situations. This understanding challenges the common misconception that suffering is a sign of God's absence or neglect. Rather than viewing our trials as random, God-ignored events, we begin to see them as part of His overarching plan, which He is using for His glory and our good. This doesn't mean that all things are good in themselves, but it means that God is sovereignly working through all things, good and bad, to bring about His perfect will. The Apostle Paul writes, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." Romans 8:28. This verse assures us that, even in the most painful circumstances, God is not absent, but instead He is orchestrating all things according to His divine wisdom and love. God's sovereignty also means that He has a purpose for every season of our lives, including the times of difficulty. When we are struggling, it can be tempting to feel as though our suffering is meaningless or unjust. Yet, recognizing that God is sovereign over every detail helps us see that there is a purpose in our pain. God does not waste suffering. While we may not always understand why certain events unfold as they do, we can trust that God is using even our hardest moments for a greater purpose. As the Apostle James writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." James 1:2-3. In this we see that trials are not random or pointless. They are part of God's refining process, shaping our character and drawing us closer to Him. His sovereignty ensures that nothing we experience is in vain. Recognizing God's sovereignty enables us to relinquish control. Many of us struggle with the desire to control our circumstances, to ensure that life unfolds according to our plans. However, this illusion of control can lead to anxiety, frustration, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility for outcomes that are beyond our ability to influence. When we acknowledge that God is sovereign, we can rest in the truth that He is in control and we are not. This recognition frees us from the burden of trying to manage every detail and outcome of our lives. It allows us to trust that God is working even when we cannot see the full picture. As the prophet Isaiah declares, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways," declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts, and your thoughts. Isaiah 55:8-9. God's wisdom surpasses ours, and His control over all things is rooted in His perfect understanding of what is best for us. God's sovereignty provides us with comfort in the midst of suffering. Knowing that God is sovereign means that He is not indifferent to our pain. He is not distant or unconcerned with our struggles. Instead, He is intimately involved, and His sovereign will is ultimately working for our good. In the midst of difficulty, it can be easy to feel abandoned or alone, but recognizing God's sovereignty assures us that He is present with us, even when we cannot perceive His presence. God is never caught off guard by our suffering, nor is He overwhelmed by the circumstances that bring us pain. Rather, He is actively at work, providing strength, comfort, and peace in ways that we may not always immediately recognize. The Apostle Paul reminds us of this truth in Romans 8:31, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" If God, in His sovereignty, is working for our good, then no difficulty, no trial, and no enemy can ultimately defeat us. Acknowledging God's sovereignty allows us to embrace the mystery of His will. There will be times when the reasons behind our suffering are unclear, or when the outcome of a situation is uncertain. In these moments our faith is tested, and it is easy to feel disoriented or fearful. However, recognizing that God is sovereign helps us trust in His purposes, even when we cannot fully understand them. We do not need to have all the answers because we know that God, who is infinitely wise and good, holds the answers. His sovereignty gives us the confidence to trust Him, even in the darkest moments, knowing that He is guiding us towards something far greater than we can comprehend.